Good evening, insomniacs. Here are 2 hours of enchanting Slavic fables to help you sleep and dream of picturesque adventures. Please let me know in the comments below if you liked it. Alanushka and her brother. Once upon a time, there were 2 orphan children, a little boy and a little girl. Their father and mother were dead, and they had not even an old grandfather to spend his time in telling them stories. They were alone. The little boy was called Vanushka, and the little girl's name was Alanushka. They set out together to walk through the whole of the great wide world. It was a long journey they set out on, and they did not think of any end to it, but only of moving on, and never stopping long enough in one place to be unhappy there. They were traveling one day over a broad plain, padding along on their little bare feet. There were no trees on the plain, no bushes, open flat country as far as you could see, and the great sun up in the sky burning the grass and making their throats dry, and the sandy ground so hot that they could scarcely bear to set their feet on it. All day from early morning they had been walking, and the heat grew greater and greater towards noon. "Oh," said little Vanushka, "my throat is so dry. I want a drink. I must have a drink, just a little drink of cool water." "We must go on," said Alanushka, "till we come to a well. Then we will drink." They went on along the track, with their eyes burning and their throats as dry as sand on a stove. But presently Vanushka cried out joyfully. He saw a horse's hoof mark in the ground, and it was full of water like a little well. "Sister, sister," says he, "the horse has made a little well for me with his great hoof, and now we can have a drink, and oh, but I am thirsty." "Not yet, brother," says Alanushka. "If you drink from the hoof mark of a horse, you will turn into a little foal, and that would never do." "I am so very thirsty," says Vanushka, but he did as his sister told him, and they walked on together under the burning sun. A little further on, Vanushka saw the hoof mark of a cow, and there was water in it glittering in the sun. "Sister, sister," says Vanushka, "the cow has made a little well for me, and now I can have a drink." "Not yet, brother," says Alanushka. "If you drink from the hoof mark of a cow, you will turn into a little calf, and that would never do. We must go on till we come to a well. There we will drink and rest ourselves. There will be trees by the well, and shadows, and we will lie down there by the quiet water and cool our hands and feet, and perhaps our eyes will stop burning." So they went on farther along the track that scorched the bare soles of their feet, and under the sun that burned their heads and their little bare necks. The sun was high in the sky above them, and it seemed to Vanushka that they would never come to the well. But when they had walked on, and he was nearly crying with thirst, only that the sun had dried up all his tears and burnt them before they had time to come into his eyes, he saw another footprint. It was quite a tiny footprint, divided in the middle, the footprint of a sheep, and in it was a little drop of clear water, sparkling in the sun. He said nothing to his sister, nothing at all. But he went down on his hands and knees and drank that water, that little drop of clear water, to cool his burning throat. And he had no sooner drunk it than he had turned into a little lamb. "A little white lamb," said Marusia. "With a black nose," said Vanya. "A little lamb," said old Peter, "a little lamb who ran round and round Alanushka, frisking and leaping, with its little tail tossing in the air." Alanushka looked round for her brother, but could not see him. But there was the little lamb, leaping round her, trying to lick her face, and there in the ground was the print left by the sheep's foot. She guessed at once what had happened, and burst into tears. There was a herrick close by, and under the herrick Alanushka sat down and wept. The little lamb, seeing her so sad, stood gravely in front of her, but not for long, for he was a little lamb, and he could not help himself. However sad he felt, he had to leap and frisk in the sun, and toss his little white tail. Presently a fine gentleman came riding by on his big black horse. He stopped when he came to the hayrick. He was very much surprised at seeing a beautiful little girl sitting there, crying her eyes out, while a white lamb frisked this way and that, and played before her, and now and then ran up to her and licked the tears from her face with its little pink tongue. "What is your name?" says the fine gentleman, "and why are you in trouble?" "Perhaps I may be able to help you. My name is Alanushka, and this is my little brother Vanushka, whom I love." And she told him the whole story. "Well, I can hardly believe all that," says the fine gentleman, "but come with me, and I will dress you in fine clothes and set silver ornaments in your hair and bracelets of gold on your little brown wrists. And as for the lamb, he shall come too, if you love him. Wherever you are, there he shall be, and you shall never be parted from him." And so Alanushka took her little brother in her arms, and the fine gentleman lifted them up before him on the big black horse and galloped home with them across the plain to his big house not far from the river. And when he got home, he made a feast and married Alanushka, and they lived together so happily that good people rejoiced to see them, and bad ones were jealous. And the little lamb lived in the house and never grew any bigger, but always frisked and played and followed Alanushka wherever she went. And then one day, when the fine gentleman had ridden far away to the town to buy a new bracelet for Alanushka, there came an old witch. Ugly she was, with only one tooth in her head, and wicked as ever went about the world doing evil to decent folk. She begged from Alanushka and said she was hungry, and Alanushka begged her to share her dinner. And she put a spell on the wine that Alanushka drank, so that Alanushka fell ill, and before evening, when the fine gentleman came riding back, had become pale, pale as snow, and as thin as an old stick. "My dear," says the fine gentleman, "what is the matter with you?" "Perhaps I shall be better tomorrow," says Alanushka. Well, the next day the gentleman rode into the fields, and the old hag came again while he was out. "Would you like me to cure you?" says she. "I know a way to make you as well as ever you were. Plump you will be, and pretty again, before your husband comes riding home." "And what must I do?" says Alanushka, crying to think herself so ugly. "You must go to the river and bathe this afternoon," says the old witch. "I will be there and put a spell on the water. Secretly you must go, for if anyone knows whither you have gone, my spell will not work." So Alanushka wrapped a shawl about her head and slipped out of the house and went to the river. Only the little lamb, Vanushka, knew where she had gone. He followed her, leaping about and tossing his little white tail. The old witch was waiting for her. She sprang out of the bushes by the riverside and seized Alanushka and tore off her pretty white dress and fastened a heavy stone about her neck and threw her from the bank into a deep place so that she sank to the bottom of the river. Then the old witch, the wicked hag, put on Alanushka's pretty white dress and cast a spell and made herself so like Alanushka to look at that nobody could tell the difference. Only the little lamb had seen everything that had happened. The fine gentleman came riding home in the evening, and he rejoiced when he saw his dear Alanushka well again, with plump pink cheeks and a smile on her rosy lips. But the little lamb knew everything. He was sad and melancholy, and would not eat, and went every morning and every evening to the river, and there wandered about the banks, and cried, "Ba, ba," and was answered by the sighing of the wind in the long reeds. The witch saw that the lamb went off by himself every morning and every evening. She watched where he went, and when she knew, she began to hate the lamb, and she gave orders for the sticks to be cut, and the iron cauldron to be heated, and the steel knives made sharp. She sent a servant to catch the lamb, and she said to the fine gentleman, who thought all the time that she was Alanushka, "It is time for the lamb to be killed and made into a tasty stew." The fine gentleman was astonished. "What?" says he, "you want to have the lamb killed? Why, you called it your brother when first I found you by the hayrick in the plain. You were always giving it caresses and sweet words. You loved it so much that I was sick of the sight of it, and now you give orders for its throat to be cut. Truly, says he, the mind of woman is like the wind in summer. The lamb ran away when he saw that the servant had come to catch him. He heard the sharpening of the knives, and had seen the cutting of the wood, and the great cauldron taken from its place. He was frightened, and he ran away, and came to the river bank where the wind was sighing through the tall reeds. And there he sang a farewell song to his sister, thinking he had not long to live. The servant followed the lamb cunningly, and crept near to catch him, and heard his little song. This is what he sang. Alanushka, little sister, they are going to slaughter me. They are cutting wooden faggots. They are heating iron cauldrons. They are sharpening knives of steel. And Alanushka, lamenting, answered the lamb from the bottom of the river. Oh, my brother Avanushka, a heavy stone is round my throat. Silken grass grows through my fingers. Yellow sand lies on my breast. The servant listened and marveled at the miracle of the lamb singing and the sweet voice answering him from the river. He crept away quietly and came to the fine gentleman and told him what he had heard, and they set out together to the river to watch the lamb and listen and see what was happening. The little white lamb stood on the bank of the river weeping, so that his tears fell into the water. And presently he sang again, Alanushka, little sister, they are going to slaughter me. They are cutting wooden faggots. They are heating iron cauldrons. They are sharpening knives of steel. And Alanushka answered him, lamenting, from the bottom of the river. Oh, my brother Avanushka, a heavy stone is round my throat. Silken grass grows through my fingers. Yellow sand lies on my breast. The fine gentleman heard, and he was sure that the voice was the voice of his own dear wife, and he remembered how she had loved the lamb. He sent his servant to fetch men and fishing nets and nets of silk. The men came running, and they dragged the river with fishing nets and brought their nets empty to land. Then they tried with nets of fine silk, and, as they drew them in, there was Alanushka lying in the nets as if she were asleep. They brought her to the bank and untied the stone from her white neck and washed her in fresh water and clothed her in white clothes. But they had no sooner done all this than she woke up, more beautiful than ever she had been before, though then she was pretty enough, God knows. She woke and sprang up and threw her arms round the neck of the little white lamb, who suddenly became once more her little brother Vanushka, who had been so thirsty as to drink water from the hoofmark of a sheep. And Vanushka laughed and shouted in the sunshine, and the fine gentleman wept tears of joy. And they all praised God and kissed each other and went home together and began to live as happily as before, even more happily, because Vanushka was no longer a lamb. But as soon as they got home, the fine gentleman turned the old witch out of the house. And she became an ugly old hag and went away to the deep woods, shrieking as she went. And did she ever come back again? Asked Ivan. No, she never came back again, said old Peter. Once was enough. And what happened to Vanushka when he grew up? He grew up as handsome as Alanushka was pretty. And he became a great hunter. And he married the sister of the fine gentleman. And they all lived happily together and ate honey every day with white bread and new milk. Salt. One evening, when they were sitting round the table after their supper, old Peter asked the children what story they would like to hear. Vanya asked whether there were any stories left which they had not already heard. Why, said old Peter, you have heard scarcely any of the stories, for there is a story to be told about everything in the world. About everything, grandfather? Asked Vanya. About everything, said old Peter. About the sky, and the thunder, and the dogs, and the flies, and the birds, and the trees, and the milk? There is a story about every one of those things. I know something there isn't a story about, said Vanya. And what's that? Asked old Peter, smiling in his beard. Salt, said Vanya. There can't be a story about salt. He put the tip of his finger into the little box of salt on the table, and then he touched his tongue with his finger to taste. But of course there is a story about salt, said old Peter. "Tell it us," said Marussia, and presently, when his pipe had been lit twice and gone out, old Peter began. "Once upon a time there were 3 brothers, and their father was a great merchant who sent his ships far over the sea and traded here and there in countries the names of which I, being an old man, can never rightly call to mind. Well, the names of the 2 elder brothers do not matter, but the youngest was called Ivan the Ninny, because he was always playing and never working, and if there was a silly thing to do, why, off he went and did it. And so, when the brothers grew up, the father sent the 2 elder ones off, each in a fine ship laden with gold and jewels, and rings and bracelets, and laces and silks, and sticks with little bits of silver hammered into their handles, and spoons with patterns of blue and red, and everything else you can think of that costs too much to buy. But he made Ivan the Ninny stay at home, and did not give him a ship at all. Ivan saw his brothers go sailing off over the sea on a summer morning to make their fortunes and come back rich men, and then, for the first time in his life, he wanted to work and do something useful. He went to his father and kissed his hand, and he kissed the hand of his little old mother, and he begged his father to give him a ship so that he could try his fortune like his brothers. But you have never done a wise thing in your life, and no one could count all the silly things you've done if he spent 100 days in counting, said his father. True, said Ivan, but now I am going to be wise, and sail the sea and come back with something in my pockets to show that I am not a ninny any longer. Give me just a little ship, father mine, just a little ship for myself. Give him a little ship, said the mother. He may not be a ninny after all. Very well, said his father. I will give him a little ship, but I am not going to waste good rubles by giving him a rich cargo. Give me any cargo you like, said Ivan. So his father gave him a little ship, a little old ship, and a cargo of rags and scraps and things that were not fit for anything but to be thrown away. And he gave him a crew of ancient old sailormen who were past work, and Ivan went on board and sailed away at sunset, like the ninny he was. And the feeble, ancient, old sailormen pulled up the ragged, dirty sails, and away they went over the sea to learn what fortune, good or bad, God had in mind for a crew of old men with a ninny for a master. The 4th day after they set sail, there came a great wind over the sea. The feeble old men did the best they could with the ship, but the old, torn sails tore from the masts, and the wind did what it pleased, and threw the little ship on an unknown island away in the middle of the sea. Then the wind dropped, and left the little ship on the beach, and Ivan the Ninny and his ancient old men, like good Russians, praising God that they were still alive. Well, children, said Ivan, for he knew how to talk to sailors, do you stay here and mend the sails, and make new ones out of the rags we carry as cargo, while I go inland and see if there is anything that could be of use to us. So the ancient old sailormen sat on deck with their legs crossed, and made sails out of rags, of torn scraps of old brocades, of soiled embroidered shawls, of all the rubbish that they had with them for a cargo. You never saw such sails. The tide came up and floated the ship, and they threw out anchors at bow and stern, and sat there in the sunlight, making sails and patching them and talking of the days when they were young. All this while Ivan the Ninny went walking off into the island. Now in the middle of that island was a high mountain it was, and so white that when he came near it, Ivan the Ninny began thinking of sheepskin coats, although it was midsummer and the sun was hot in the sky. The trees were green round about, but there was nothing growing on the mountain at all. It was just a great white mountain piled up into the sky in the middle of a green island. Ivan walked a little way up the white slopes of the mountain, and then, because he felt thirsty, he thought he would let a little snow melt in his mouth. He took some in his fingers and stuffed it in. Quickly enough it came out again, I can tell you, for the mountain was not made of snow, but of good Russian salt. And if you want to try what a mouthful of salt is like, you may. No, thank you, grandfather, the children said hurriedly together. Old Peter went on with his tale. Ivan the Ninny did not stop to think twice. The salt was so clean and shone so brightly in the sunlight. He just turned round and ran back to the shore and called out to his ancient old sailormen and told them to empty everything they had on board over into the sea. Over it all went rags and tags and rotten timbers till the little ship was as empty as a soup bowl after supper. And then those ancient old men were set to work carrying salt from the mountain and taking it on board the little ship and stowing it away below deck till there was not room for another grain. Ivan the ninny would have liked to take the whole mountain, but there was not room in the little ship. And for that the ancient old sailormen thanked God, because their backs ached and their old legs were weak, and they said they would have died if they had had to carry any more. Then they hoisted up the new sails they had patched together out of the rags and scraps of shawls and old brocades, and they sailed away once more over the blue sea. And the wind stood fair, and they sailed before it, and the ancient old sailors rested their backs and told old tales and took turn and turnabout at the rudder. And after many days sailing they came to a town with towers and churches and painted roofs, all set on the side of a hill that sloped down into the sea. At the foot of the hill was a quiet harbor, and they sailed in there and moored the ship and hauled down their patchwork sails. Ivan the ninny went ashore and took with him a little bag of clean white salt to show what kind of goods he had for sale, and he asked his way to the palace of the Tsar of that town. He came to the palace and went in and bowed to the ground before the Tsar. "Who are you?" says the Tsar. "I, great lord, am a Russian merchant, and here in a bag is some of my merchandise, and I beg your leave to trade with your subjects in this town." "Let me see what is in the bag," says the Tsar. Ivan the ninny took a handful from the bag and showed it to the Tsar. "What is it?" says the Tsar. "Good Russian salt," says Ivan the ninny. Now in that country they had never heard of salt, and the Tsar looked at the salt, and he looked at Ivan, and he laughed. "Why, this," says he, "is nothing but white dust, and that we can pick up for nothing. The men of my town have no need to trade with you. You must be a ninny." Ivan grew very red, for he knew what his father used to call him. He was ashamed to say anything. So he bowed to the ground and went away out of the palace. But when he was outside, he thought to himself, "I wonder what sort of salt they use in these parts if they do not know good Russian salt when they see it. I will go to the kitchen." So he went round to the back door of the palace and put his head into the kitchen and said, "I am very tired. May I sit down here and rest a little while?" "Come in," says one of the cooks. "But you must sit just there and not put even your little finger in the way of us, for we are the Tsar's cooks, and we are in the middle of making ready his dinner." And the cook put a stool in a corner out of the way, and Ivan slipped in round the door and sat down in the corner and looked about him. There were 7 cooks at least, boiling and baking, and stewing and toasting, and roasting and frying. And as for scullions, they were as thick as cockroaches, dozens of them running to and fro, tumbling over each other, and helping the cooks. Ivan the ninny sat on his stool, with his legs tucked under him and the bag of salt on his knees. He watched the cooks and the scullions, but he did not see them put anything in the dishes which he thought could take the place of salt. No, the meat was without salt, the kasha was without salt, and there was no salt in the potatoes. Ivan nearly turned sick at the thought of the tastelessness of all that food. There came the moment when all the cooks and scullions ran out of the kitchen to fetch the silver platters on which to lay the dishes. Ivan slipped down from his stool, and running from stove to stove, from saucepan to frying pan, he dropped a pinch of salt, just what was wanted, no more no less, in every one of the dishes. Then he ran back to the stool in the corner and sat there and watched the dishes being put on the silver platters and carried off in gold-embroidered napkins to be the dinner of the Tsar. The Tsar sat at table and took his first spoonful of soup. "The soup is very good today," says he, and he finishes the soup to the last drop. "I've never known the soup so good," says the Tsaritsa, and she finishes hers. "This is the best soup I ever tasted," says the princess, and down goes hers, and she, was the prettiest princess who ever had dinner in this world. It was the same with the kasha and the same with the meat. The Tsar and the Tsaritsa and the princess wondered why they had never had so good a dinner in all their lives before. "Call the cooks," says the Tsar. And they called the cooks, and the cooks all came in and bowed to the ground and stood in a row before the Tsar. "What did you put in the dishes today that you never put before?" says the Tsar. "We put nothing unusual, Your Greatness," say the cooks, and bowed to the ground again. "Then why do the dishes taste better?" "We do not know, Your Greatness," say the cooks. "Call the scullions," says the Tsar. And the scullions were called, and they too bowed to the ground and stood in a row before the Tsar. "What was done in the kitchen today that has not been done there before?" says the Tsar. "Nothing, Your Greatness," say all the scullions except one. And that one scullion bowed again and kept on bowing, and then he said, "Please, Your Greatness, please, great Lord, there is usually none in the kitchen but ourselves. But today there was a young Russian merchant who sat on a stool in the corner and said he was tired." "Call the merchant," says the Tsar. So they brought in Ivan the ninny, and he bowed before the Tsar and stood there with his little bag of salt in his hand. "Did you do anything to my dinner?" says the Tsar. "I did, Your Greatness," says Ivan. "What did you do?" "I put a pinch of Russian salt in every dish." "That white dust?" says the Tsar. "Nothing but that." "Have you got any more of it?" "I have a little ship in the harbor laden with nothing else," says Ivan. "It is the most wonderful dust in the world," says the Tsar, "and I will buy every grain of it you have." "What do you want for it?" Ivan the ninny scratched his head and thought. He thought that if the Tsar liked it as much as all, that it must be worth a fair price. So he said, "We will put the salt into bags, and for every bag of salt you must give me 3 bags of the same weight, one of gold, one of silver, and one of precious stones. Cheaper than that, Your Greatness, I could not possibly sell." "Agreed," says the Tsar. "And a cheap price, too, for a dust so full of magic that it makes dull dishes tasty, and tasty dishes so good that there is no looking away from them." So all the day long, and far into the night, the ancient old sailormen bent their backs under sacks of salt, and bent them again under sacks of gold and silver and precious stones. When all the salt had been put in the Tsar's treasury, yes, with 20 soldiers guarding it with great swords shining in the moonlight, and when the little ship was loaded with riches, so that even the deck was piled high with precious stones, the ancient old men lay down among the jewels and slept till morning, when Ivan the ninny went to bid goodbye to the Tsar. "And whither shall you sail now?" asked the Tsar. "I shall sail away to Russia in my little ship," says Ivan. And the princess, who was very beautiful, said, "A little Russian ship." "Yes," says Ivan. "I have never seen a Russian ship," says the princess, and she begs her father to let her go to the harbor with her nurses and maids to see the little Russian ship before Ivan set sail. She came with Ivan to the harbor, and the ancient old sailormen took them on board. She ran all over the ship, looking now at this and now at that, and Ivan told her the names of everything, deck, mast, and rudder. "May I see the sails?" she asked. And the ancient old men hoisted the ragged sails, and the wind filled the sails and tugged. "Why doesn't the ship move when the sails are up?" asked the princess. "The anchor holds her," said Ivan. "Please let me see the anchor," says the princess. "Haul up the anchor, my children, and show it to the princess," says Ivan to the ancient old sailormen. And the old men hauled up the anchor and showed it to the princess, and she said it was a very good little anchor. But, of course, as soon as the anchor was up, the ship began to move. One of the ancient old men bent over the tiller, and, with a fair wind behind her, the little ship slipped out of the harbor and away to the blue sea. When the princess looked round, thinking it was time to go home, the little ship was far from land, and away in the distance she could only see the gold towers of her father's palace, glittering like pinpoints in the sunlight. Her nurses and maids wrung their hands and made an outcry, and the princess sat down on a heap of jewels and put a handkerchief to her eyes and cried and cried and cried. Ivan the ninny took her hands and comforted her and told her of the wonders of the sea that he would show her and the wonders of the land. And she looked up at him while he talked, and his eyes were kind and hers were sweet, and the end of it was that they were both very well content and agreed to have a marriage feast as soon as the little ship should bring them to the home of Ivan's father. Merry was that voyage. All day long Ivan and the princess sat on deck and said sweet things to each other, and at twilight they sang songs and drank tea and told stories. As for the nurses and maids, the princess told them to be glad, and so they danced and clapped their hands and ran about the ship and teased the ancient old sailormen. When they had been sailing many days, the princess was looking out over the sea, and she cried out to Ivan, "See, over there, far away, are two big ships with white sails, not like our sails of brocade and bits of silk." Ivan looked, shading his eyes with his hands. "Why, those are the ships of my elder brothers," said he. "We shall all sail home together." And he made the ancient old sailormen give a hail in their cracked old voices. And the brothers heard them and came on board to greet Ivan and his bride. And when they saw that she was a Tsar's daughter, and that the very decks were heaped with precious stones, because there was no room below, they said one thing to Ivan and something else to each other. To Ivan they said, "Thanks be to God, he has given you good trading." But to each other, "How can this be?" says one. "Ivan the ninny bringing back such a cargo, while we in our fine ships have only a bag or two of gold. And what is Ivan the ninny doing with the princess?" says the other. And they ground their teeth and waited their time and came up suddenly when Ivan was alone in the twilight and picked him up by his head and his heels and hove him overboard into the dark blue sea. Not one of the old men had seen them, and the princess was not on deck. In the morning they said that Ivan the ninny must have walked overboard in his sleep. And they drew lots. The eldest brother took the princess, and the second brother took the little ship laden with gold and silver and precious stones. And so the brothers sailed home very well content. But the princess sat and wept all day long, looking down into the blue water. The elder brother could not comfort her, and the second brother did not try. And the ancient old sailormen muttered in their beards, and were sorry, and prayed to God to give rest to Ivan's soul, for although he had been a ninny, and although he had made them carry a lot of salt and other things, yet they loved him, because he knew how to talk to ancient old sailormen. But Ivan was not dead. As soon as he splashed into the water, he crammed his fur hat a little tighter on his head, and began swimming in the sea. He swam about until the sun rose, and then, not far away, he saw a floating timber log, and he swam to the log and got astride of it and thanked God. And he sat there on the log in the middle of the sea, twiddling his thumbs for want of something to do. There was a strong current in the sea that carried him along, and at last, after floating for many days without ever a bite for his teeth or a drop for his gullet, his feet touched land. Now that was at night, and he left the log and walked up out of the sea, and lay down on the shore and waited for morning. When the sun rose he stood up, and saw that he was on a bare island, and he saw nothing at all on the island except a huge house as big as a mountain, and as he was looking at the house the great door creaked with a noise like that of a hurricane among the pine forests, and opened, and a giant came walking out, and came to the shore, and stood there, looking down at Ivan. "What are you doing here, little one?" says the giant. Ivan told him the whole story, just as I have told it to you. The giant listened to the very end, pulling at his monstrous whiskers. Then he said, "Listen, little one. I know more of the story than you, for I can tell you that tomorrow morning your eldest brother is going to marry your princess. But there is no need for you to take on about it. If you want to be there, I will carry you and set you down before the house in time for the wedding. And a fine wedding it is like to be, for your father thinks well of those brothers of yours, bringing back all those precious stones and silver and gold enough to buy a kingdom." And with that he picked up Ivan the ninny and set him on his great shoulders and set off striding through the sea. He went so fast that the wind of his going blew off Ivan's hat. "Stop a moment," shouts Ivan, "my hat has blown off." "We can't turn back for that," says the giant, we have already left your hut 500 versts behind us." And he rushed on, splashing through the sea. The sea was up to his armpits. He rushed on, and the sea was up to his waist. He rushed on, and before the sun had climbed to the top of the blue sky, he was splashing up out of the sea with the water about his ankles. He lifted Ivan from his shoulders and set him on the ground. "Now," says he, "little man, off you run, and you'll be in time for the feast. But don't you dare to boast about riding on my shoulders. If you open your mouth about that, you'll smart for it if I have to come 10,000 versts." Ivan the ninny thanked the giant for carrying him through the sea, promised that he would not boast, and then ran off to his father's house. Long before he got there, he heard the musicians in the courtyard playing as if they wanted to wear out their instruments before night. The wedding feast had begun, and when Ivan ran in, there, at the high board, was sitting the princess, and beside her his eldest brother. And there were his father and mother, his second brother, and all the guests. And every one of them was as merry as could be, except the princess, and she was as white as the salt he had sold to her father. Suddenly the blood flushed into her cheeks. She saw Ivan in the doorway. Up she jumped at the high board and cried out, There's my true love, and not this man who sits beside me at the table." "What is this?" says Ivan's father, and in a few minutes knew the whole story. He turned the two elder brothers out of doors, gave their ships to Ivan, married him to the princess, and made him his heir. And the wedding feast began again, and they sent for the ancient old sailormen to take part in it. And the ancient old sailormen wept with joy when they saw Ivan and the princess, like two sweet pigeons, sitting side by side, yes, and they lifted their flagons with their old shaking hands, and cheered with their old cracked voices, and poured the wine down their dry old throats. There was wine enough and to spare, beer too, and mead enough to drown a herd of cattle. And as the guests drank and grew merry and proud, they set to boasting. This one bribed of his riches, that one of his wife. Another boasted of his cunning, another of his new house, another of his strength, and this one was angry because they would not let him show how he could lift the table on one hand. They all drank Ivan's health, and he drank theirs, and in the end he could not bear to listen to their proud boasts. "That's all very well," says he, "but I am the only man in the world who rode on the shoulders of a giant to come to his wedding feast." The words were scarcely out of his mouth before there were a tremendous trampling and a roar of a great wind. The house shook with the footsteps of the giant as he strode up. The giant bent down over the courtyard and looked in at the feast. little man, says he, "you promised not to boast of me. I told you what would come if you did, and here you are and have boasted already." "Forgive me," says Ivan. "It was the drink that boasted, not I." "What sort of drink is it that knows how to boast?" says the giant. "You shall taste it," says Ivan. And he made his ancient old sailormen roll a great barrel of wine into the yard, more than enough for 100 men, and after that a barrel of beer that was as big, and then a barrel of meat that was no smaller. "Try the taste of that," says Ivan the ninny. Well, the giant did not wait to be asked twice. He lifted the barrel of wine as if it had been a little glass, and emptied it down his throat. He lifted the barrel of beer as if it had been an acorn, and emptied it after the wine. Then he lifted the barrel of mead as if it had been a very small pea, and swallowed every drop of mead that was in it. And after that he began stamping about and breaking things. Houses fell to pieces this way and that, and trees were swept flat like grass. Every step the giant took was followed by the crash of breaking timbers. Then suddenly he fell flat on his back and slept. For 3 days and nights he slept without waking. At last he opened his eyes. "Just look about you," says Ivan, "and see the damage that you've done." "And did that little drop of drink make me do all that?" says the giant. Well, I can well understand that a drink like that can do a bit of bragging." And after that, says he, looking at the wrecks of houses and all the broken things scattered about. After that, says he, you can boast of me for 1,000 years, and I'll have nothing against you. And he tugged at his great whiskers and wrinkled his eyes and went striding off into the sea. That is the story about salt and how it made a rich man of Ivan the Ninny, and besides, gave him the prettiest wife in the world, and she a Tsar's daughter. Seven Simeons. In an empire, in a country beyond many seas and islands, beyond high mountains, beyond large rivers, upon a level expanse, as if spread upon a table, there stood a large town, and in that town there lived a Tsar called Arkady, the son of Agiai. Therefore he was called Agivich. A famous Tsar he was, and a clever one. His wealth could not be counted, his warriors were innumerable. There were 40 times 40 towns in his kingdom, and in each one of these towns there were 10 palaces with silver doors and golden ceilings and magnificent crystal windows. For his council 12 wise men were selected, each one of them having a beard half a yard long and a head full of wisdom. These advisors offered nothing but truth to their father sovereign. None ever dared advance a lie. How could such a Tsar be anything but happy? But it is true, indeed, that neither wealth nor wisdom give happiness when the heart is not at ease, and even in golden palaces the poor heart often aches. So it was with the Tsar Arkady. He was rich and clever, besides being a handsome fellow, but he could not find a bride to his taste, a bride with wit and beauty equal to his own. And this was the cause of the Tsar Arkady's sorrow and distress. One day he was sitting in his golden armchair, looking out of the window lost in thought. He had gazed for quite a while before he noticed foreign sailors landing opposite the imperial palace. The sailors ran their ship up to the wharf, reefed their white sails, threw the heavy anchor into the sea, and prepared the plank ready to go ashore. Before them all walked an old merchant. White was his beard, and he had about him the air of a wise man. An idea suddenly occurred to the Tsar. Sea merchants generally are well informed on many subjects. If I ask them, perchance I shall find that they have met somewhere a princess, beautiful and clever, suitable for me, the Tsar Arkady. Without delay, the order was given to call the sea merchants into the halls of the palace. The merchant guests appeared, prayed to the holy icons hanging in the corner, bowed to the Tsar, bowed to the wise advisors. The Tsar ordered his servants to serve them with tumblers of strong green wine. The guests drank the strong green wine and wiped their beards with embroidered towels. Then the Tsar Arkady addressed them. We are aware that you gallant sea merchants cross all the big waters and see many wonderful things. My desire is to ask you about something, and you must give a straightforward answer without any deceit or evasion. So be it. Mighty Tsar Arkady Agivich, answered the merchant guests, bowing. Well, then, can you tell me if somewhere in an empire or kingdom, or among great princes, there is a maiden as beautiful and wise as I myself, Tsar Arkady, an illustrious maiden who would be a proper wife for me, a suitable tsaritsa for my country? The merchant guests seemed to be puzzled, and after a long silence, the eldest among them thus replied. Indeed, I once heard that yonder beyond the great sea, on an island called Busan, there is a great country, and the sovereign of that land has a daughter named Helena, a princess very beautiful, not less so, I dare say, than myself. And wise she is, too. A wise man once tried for 3 years to guess a riddle that she gave, and did not succeed. How far is that island, pray tell, and where are the roads that lead to it? The island is not near, answered the old merchant. If one chooses the wide sea, he must journey 10 years. Besides, the way to it is not known to us. Moreover, even suppose we did know the way, it seems that the Princess Helena is not a bride for thee. The Tsar Arkady shouted with anger. How dost thou dare to speak such words, thou, a long-bearded buck? Thy will be done, but think for thyself. Suppose thou shouldst send an envoy to the island of Busan. He would require 10 long years to go there, 10 years equally long to come back, and so his journey would require fully 20 years. By that time, a most beautiful princess would grow old. A girl's beauty is like the swallow, a bird of passage. It lasts not long. The Tsar Archetype became thoughtful. "Well," he said to the merchant guests, "you have my thanks, guests of passage, respectable men of trade. Go in God's name, transact business in my tsarstvo without any taxes whatever. What to do about the beautiful Princess Helena I will try to think out by myself." The merchants bowed low and left the Tsar's rich palace. The Tsar Archetype sat still, wrapped in thought, but he could find neither beginning nor end to the problem. "Let me ride into the wide fields," he said. "Let me forget my sorrow amid the excitement of the noble hunt, hoping that the future may bring advice." The falconers appeared, cheerful notes from the golden trumpets resounded, and falcons and hawks were soon slumbering under their velvet caps as they sat quietly on the fingers of the hunters. The Tsar Arkadayevich came with his men to a wide, wide field. All of his men were watching the moment to loose their falcons in order to let the birds pursue a long-legged heron or a white-breasted swan. Now, you, my listeners, must understand that the fairy tale is quick, but life is not. The Tsar Archetype was on horseback for a long while and finally came to a green valley. Looking around, he saw a well-cultivated field where the golden ears of the grain were already ripe, and oh, how beautiful. The Tsar stopped in admiration. "I presume," he exclaimed, "that good workers are owners of this place, honest plowmen and diligent sowers. If only all fields in my tsarstvo were equally cultivated, my people need never know what hunger means, and there would even be plenty to send beyond the sea to be exchanged for silver and gold." Then the Tsar Archetype gave orders to inquire who the owners of the field were and what were their names. Hunters, grooms, and servants rushed in all directions and discovered 7 brave fellows, all of them fair, red-cheeked, and very handsome. They were dining according to the peasant fashion, which means that they were eating rye bread with onions and drinking clear water. Their blouses were red, with a golden galloon around the neck, and they were so much alike that one could hardly be recognized from another. The royal messengers approached. "Whose field is this?" they asked. "This field with golden wheat." The 7 brave peasants answered cheerfully, "This is our field. We plowed it, and we also have sown the golden wheat." "And what kind of people are you?" "We are the Tsar Arkadyevич's peasants, farmers, and we are brothers, sons of one father and mother. The name for all of us is Simeon, so you understand we are 7 Simeons." This answer was faithfully delivered to the Tsar Archetype by the envoys, and the Tsar at once desired to see the brave peasants and ordered them to be called before him. The 7 Simeons presently appeared and bowed. The Tsar looked at them with his bright eyes and asked them, "What kind of people are you whose field is so well cultivated?" One of the 7 brothers, the eldest of them, answered, "We are all thy peasants, simpletons, without any wisdom, born of peasant parents, all of us children of the same father and the same mother, and all having the same name, Simeon. Our old father taught us to pray to God, to obey thee, to pay taxes faithfully, and besides to work and toil without rest. He also taught to each of us a trade, for the old saying is, a trade is no burden, but a profit. The old father wished us to keep our trades for a cloudy day, but never to forsake our own fields, and always to be contented and plow and harrow diligently. He also used to say, if one does not neglect the Mother Earth, but thoroughly harrows and sows in due season, then she, our mother, will reward generously, and will give plenty of bread, besides preparing a soft place for the everlasting rest when one is old and tired of life." The Tsar Archetype liked the simple answer of the peasant and said, "Take my praise, brave good fellows, my peasants, tillers of the soil, sowers of wheat, gatherers of gold. And now tell me, what trades did your father teach you, and what do you know?" The first Simeon answered, "My trade is not a very wise one. If thou wouldst let me have materials and working men, then I could build a post, a white stone column reaching beyond the clouds, almost to the sky. Good enough, exclaimed the Tsar Arkadai. "And thou, the second Simeon, what is thy trade?" The second Simeon was quick to give answer. "My trade is a simple one. If my brother will build a white stone column, I can climb upon that column high up in the sky, and I shall see from above all the empires and all the kingdoms under the sun, and everything which is going on in those foreign countries. Thy trade is not so bad either." And the Tsar smiled and looked at the third brother. "And thou, third Simeon, what trade is thine?" The third Simeon also had his answer ready. "My trade is simple, too, that is to say, a peasant's trade. If thou art in need of ships, thy learned men of foreign birth build them for thee as well as their wisdom teaches them. But if thou wilt order, I will build them simply 1, 2. And the ship is ready. My ships will be the result of the quick headwork of a peasant simpleton. But where a foreign ship sails a year, mine will sail an hour, and where others take 10 years, mine will take not longer than a week." Well, laughed the Tsar. "And thy trade, the fourth Simeon?" he asked. The fourth brother bowed. "My trade needs no wisdom either. If my brother will build thee a ship, I then will sail that ship, and if an enemy gives chase or a tempest rises, I'll seize the ship by the black prow and plunge her into the deep waters where there is eternal quiet, and after the storm is over or the enemy far, I'll again guide her to the surface of the wide sea." "Good," approved the Tsar. "And thou, fifth Simeon, what dost thou know? Hast thou also a trade?" "My trade, Tsar Arkadai, is not a fair one, for I am a blacksmith. If thou wouldst order a shop built for me, I at once would forge a self-shooting gun, and no eagle far above in the sky or wild beast in the wood would be safe from that gun." "Not bad either," answered the Tsar Arkadai, well pleased. "Thy turn now, sixth Simeon." "My trade is no trade," answered the sixth Simeon rather humbly. "If my brother shoots a bird or a beast, never mind what or where, I can catch it before it falls down, catch it even better than a hunting dog. If the prey should fall into the blue sea, I'll find it at the sea's bottom. Should it fall into the depth of the dark woods, I'll find it there in the midst of night. Should it get caught in a cloud, I'll find it even there." The Tsar Arkadai evidently liked the trade of the sixth Simeon very well also. These were all simple trades, you see, without any wisdom whatever, but rather entertaining. The Tsar also liked the peasants' speech, and he said to them, "Thanks, my peasants, tillers of the soil, my faithful workers. Your father's words are true ones. A trade is not a burden, but a profit. Now come to my capital for a trial. People like you are welcome. And when the season for harvest arrives, the time to reap, to bind in bundles the golden grain, to thresh and carry the wheat to the market, I will let you go home with my royal grace." Then all the 7 Simeons bowed very low. "Thine is the will," said they, "and we are thy obedient subjects." Here the Tsar Arkadai looked at the youngest Simeon and remembered that he had not asked him about his trade. So he said, "And thou, 7th Simeon, what is thy trade?" "I have none, Tsar Arkadai. I learned many, but not a single one did me any good, and though I know something very well, I am not sure your majesty would like it." "Let us know thy secret," ordered the Tsar Arkadai. "No, Tsar Arkadai. Give me, first of all, thy royal word not to kill me for my inborn talent, but to have mercy upon me. Then only will I be willing to disclose my secret. Thy wish is granted. I give thee my royal word, true and not to be broken, that whatever thou shalt disclose to me, I will have mercy upon thee." Hearing these kind words, the 7th Simeon smiled, looked around, shook his curls and began, "My trade is one for which there is no mercy in thy tsarstvo, and it is the one thing I am able to do. My trade is to steal and to hide the trace of how and when. There is no treasure, no fortunate possession, not even a bewitched one, nor a secret place that could be forbidden me if it be my wish to steal." As soon as these bold words of the 7th Simeon reached the Tsar's ears, he became very angry. "No," he exclaimed, "I certainly shall not pardon thee, thief and burglar. I will give orders for thy cruel death. I will have thee chained and thrown into my subterranean prison with nothing but bread and water for food until thou forget thy trade. Great and merciful Tsar Arkady Agivich, postpone thy orders." "Listen to my peasant talk," prayed the seventh Simeon. "Our old Russian saying is, he is no thief who is not caught, and neither is he who steals, but the one who instigates the theft. If my wish had been to steal, I should have done it long ago. I should have stolen thy treasures, and the judges would not have objected to take a small share of them, and I could have built a white-walled stone palace and have been rich. But, mark this, I am a stupid peasant of low origin. I know well enough how to steal, but will not. If thy wish were to learn my trade, how could I keep it from thee? And if thou, for this sincere acknowledgment, wilt have me put to death, then what is the value of thy royal word?" The Tsar thought a moment. "For this time," he said, "I will not let thee die, for it pleases me to grant thee my grace. But from this very day, this very hour, thou never shalt see God's light, nor the bright sunshine, nor the silvery moon. Thou shalt never walk at liberty through the white fields, but thou, my dear guest, shalt dwell in a palace where no sunny ray ever penetrates. You, my servants, take him, chain his hands and his feet, and lead him to my chief jailer. And you 6 Simeons follow me. You have my grace and reward. Tomorrow every one of you will begin to work for me according to his gifts and capacities." The 6 Simeons followed the Tsar Arkady, and the 7th brother, the youngest, the beloved one, was fallen upon by the servants, taken away to the dark prison and heavily chained. The Tsar Arkady ordered carpenters to be sent to the first Simeon, as well as masons and blacksmiths and all sorts of workingmen. He also ordered a supply of bricks, stones, iron, clay, and cement. Without any delay, Simeon, the first brother, began to build a column, and according to his simple peasant's habits his work progressed rapidly, and not a moment was wasted in clever combinations. In a short time, the white column was ready, and lo, how high it went! As high as the great planets. The smaller stars were beneath it, and from above the people seemed to be like bugs. The second Simeon climbed the column, looked around, listened to all sounds, and came down. The Tsar Arkady, anxious to know about everything under the sun, ordered him to report, and Simeon did so. He told the Tsar Arkady all the wonderful doings all over the world. He told how one king was fighting another, where there was war and where there was peace, and with other things the second Simeon even mentioned deep secrets, quite surprising secrets, which made the Tsar Arkady smile, and the courtiers, encouraged by the royal smile, roared with laughter. Meantime, the third Simeon was accomplishing something in his line. After crossing himself 3 times, the fellow rolled up his sleeves to the elbow, took a hatchet, and 1, 2, without any haste built a vessel. What a curious vessel it was! The Tsar Arkady watched the wonderful structure from the shore, and as soon as the orders were given for sailing, the new vessel sailed away like a white-winged hawk. The cannon were shooting, and upon the masts, instead of rigging, were drawn strings upon which musicians were playing the national tunes. As soon as the wonderful vessel sailed into deep water, the 4th Simeon snatched the prow, and no trace of it remained on the surface. The whole vessel went to the depths like a heavy stone. In an hour or so, Simeon, with his left hand, led the ship to the blue surface of the sea again, and with his right he presented to the Tsar a most magnificent sturgeon for his kulibyaka, the famous Russian fish pie. While the Tsar Arkady enjoyed himself with looking at the marvelous vessel, the 5th Simeon built a blacksmith shop in the court back of the palace. There he blew the bellows and heated the iron. The noise from his hammers was great, and the result of his peasant work was a self-shooting gun. The Tsar Arkady Agivich went to the wild fields and perceived high above him, very high under the sky, an eagle flying. "No," exclaimed the Tsar, "there is an eagle forgetting himself with watching the sun. Shoot it. Perchance thou shalt have the good luck to hit it. Then I will honor thee." Simeon shook his locks, smiled, put into his gun a silver bullet, aimed, shot, and the eagle fell swiftly to the earth. The sixth Simeon did not even allow the eagle to fall to the ground, but, quick as a flash, he ran under it with a plate, caught it on that big plate, and presented his prey to the Tsar Arkadai. "Thanks, thanks, my brave fellows, faithful peasants, tillers of the soil," exclaimed the Tsar Arkadai gaily. "I see now plainly that all of you are men of trade, and I wish to reward you. But now go to your dinner and rest a while." The six Simeons bowed to the Tsar very low, prayed to the holy icons, and went. They were already seated, had time to swallow each one a tumbler of the strong, green wine, took up the round wooden spoons in order to attack the stew, the Russian cabbage soup, when lo! The Tsar's fool came running and shaking his striped cap with the round bells and shouted, "You ignorant simpletons, unlearned peasants, moujiks! Is it a suitable moment for dinner when the Tsar wants you? Go in haste." All the six started running toward the palace, thinking within themselves, what can have happened? In front of the palace stood the guards with their iron staves. In the halls all the wise and learned people were gathered together, and the Tsar himself was sitting on his high throne looking very grim and thoughtful. "Listen to me," he said when the peasants approached. "You, my brave fellows, my clever brother Simeon. I like your trades, and I think, as do my wise advisors, that if thou, the second Simeon, art able to see everything going on under the sun, thou shouldst climb quickly on yonder column and glance around to see if there is, as they say, beyond the great sea an island, Busan by name. And see if on that island, as men assert, there is a mighty kingdom, and in that kingdom a mighty king, and if that king, as the story goes, has a daughter, the most beautiful Princess Helena." The second Simeon bowed and ran quickly, even forgetting to put on his cap. He went straight to the column, climbed it, looked around, came down, and this was his report. "Tsar Arkadai Agivich, I have accomplished thy sovereign wish. I looked far beyond the sea and have seen the island Busan. Mighty is the king there, and he is proud and merciless. He sits within his palace, and his speech is always the same. I am a great king, and I have a most beautiful daughter, the Princess Helena. There is no one in the universe more beautiful and more wise than she. There is no bridegroom worthy of her in any place under the bright sun, no Tsar, no king, no Tsarevich, no Korolovich. To no one will I ever give my daughter, the Princess Helena, and whoever shall dare to court her, on such an one will I declare war, ruin his country, and capture himself." "And how great is the army of that king?" asked the Tsar Arkadai. "And also how far is his kingdom from my Tsarstvo?" "Well, according to the measure of my eyes," answered Simeon, "I fancy it would take a ship 10 years less 2 days, or, if it happened to be stormy, I am afraid even a little longer than 10 years. And that king has not a small army. I have seen altogether 100,000 spearmen, 100,000 armed men, and 100,000 or more could be gathered from the Tsar's court, from his servants, and all kinds of underlings. Besides, there is no small armament of guards held in reserve for a special occasion, fed and petted by the king." The Tsar Arkadai remained for a long time in thoughtful silence and finally addressed his court people. "My warriors and advisors, I have but one wish. I want the Princess Helena for my wife. But tell me, how can I reach her?" The wise advisors remained silent, hiding themselves behind each other. The third Simeon looked around, bowed to the Tsar, and said, "Tsar Arkadai Agivich, forgive my simple words. How to reach the island of Busan there is no need to worry about. Sit down on my ship. She is simply built and equipped without any wise tricks. Where others require a year, she takes but a day, and where other ships take 10 years, mine will take, let us say, a week. Only order thine advisors to decide whether we ought to fight for or peacefully court the beautiful princess." Now, my warriors brave, my advisor sage, spoke the Tsar Arkady to his men. How will you decide upon this matter? Who among you will go to fight for the princess, or who will be shrewd enough to bring her peacefully here? I will pour gold and silver over that one. I will give to him the first rank among the very first. And again the brave warriors and the sage advisors remained silent. The Tsar grew angry. He seemed to be ready for a terrible word. Then, as if somebody had asked the fool, out he jumped from behind the wise people with his foolish talk, shook his striped fool's cap, rang his many bells, and shouted, "Why so silent, wise men? Why so deep in thought? You have big heads and long beards. It would seem that there is plenty of wisdom, so why not show it? To go to the island of Busan to obtain the bride does not mean to lose gold or army. Have you already forgotten the seventh Simeon? Why, it will be simple enough for him to steal the Princess Helena. Afterwards, let the King of Busan come here to fight us, and we will welcome him as an honored guest. But do not forget that he must take 10 years' time to reach us, and in 10 years, me. I have heard that some wise man somewhere undertook to teach a horse to talk in 10 years. Good. Good, exclaimed the Tsar Arkady, forgetting even his anger. I thank thee, striped fool. I certainly shall reward thee. Thou must have a new cap with noisy bells, and each one of thy children a ginger pancake. You, faithful servants, run quickly and bring here the seventh Simeon. According to the Tsar's bidding, the heavy iron gates of the dark prison were thrown open, the heavy chains were taken off, and the seventh Simeon appeared before the eager eyes of the Tsar Arkady, who thus addressed him. Listen to me attentively, thou seventh Simeon, for I had almost decided to grant thee a high honor, to keep thee thy life long in my prison. But if thou shouldst prove useful to me, then will I give thee freedom, and besides, thou shalt have a share out of my treasures. Art thou able to steal the beautiful Princess Helena from her father, the mighty king of the island of Busan? And why not? Cheerfully laughed the seventh Simeon. There is nothing difficult about it. She is not a pearl, and I presume she is not under too many locks. Only order the ship which my brother had built for thee to be loaded with velvets and brocades, with Persian rugs, beautiful pearls and precious stones, and bid my 4 brothers come along with me. But the 2 eldest keep thou as hostages. Once said, quickly done. The Tsar Arkady gave orders while all were running hither and thither, and everything was finished so promptly that a short-haired girl would scarcely have had time to plait her hair. The ship, laden with velvets, brocades, with Persian rugs and pearls, and costly precious stones, was ready. The 5 brothers, the brave Simeons, were ready. They bowed to the Tsar, spread sail, and disappeared. The ship floated swiftly over the blue waters. She flew like a hawk in comparison with the slow merchant vessels, and in a week after the 5 Simeons had left their native land, they sighted the island of Busan. The island appeared to be surrounded with cannon as thick as peas. The gigantic guards walked up and down the shores, tugging fiercely at their big mustaches. As soon as the ship became visible from a tower, somebody shouted through a Dutch trumpet, "Stop! Answer! What kind of people are ye? Why come ye here?" The 7th Simeon answered from the ship, "We are a peaceful people, not enemies, but friends, merchants everywhere welcomed as guests. We bring foreign merchandise. We want to sell, to buy, and to exchange. We also have gifts for your king and for the Korolevna." The 5 brothers, our brave Simeons, lowered the boat, loaded it with choice Venetian velvets, brocades, pearls, and precious stones, and covered all with Persian rugs. They rowed to the wharf, and landing near the king's palace, at once carried their gifts to the king. The beautiful Korolevna Helena was sitting in her harem. She was a fair maiden with eyes like stars and eyebrows like precious sable. When she looked at one, it was like receiving a gift, and when she walked, it was like the graceful swimming of a swan. The Korolevna was quick to notice the brave, handsome brothers and at once called her nurses and maidens. Hasten, my dear nurses, and you, swift maidens, find out what kind of strangers are these coming to our royal palace. All of the nurses, all of the maidens, ran out with questions ready. The seventh Simeon answered them thus: "We are merchant guests, peaceful people. Our native land is the country of the Tsar Arkady Agivich, a great Tsar indeed. We came to sell, to buy, to exchange. Moreover, we have gifts for the king and his princess. We do hope the king will favor us and will accept these trifles, if not for himself, at least for the adornment of his court's lovely maidens." When Helena heard these words, she at once let the merchants in. And the merchants appeared, bowed low to the beautiful Korolevna, unfolded the showy velvets and golden brocades, strewed around the pearls and precious stones, such stones and pearls as had never been seen before in Busan. The nurses and the maidens opened their mouths in amazement, and the Korolevna herself seemed to be greatly pleased. The seventh Simeon, quick to understand, smiled and said, "We all know thee to be as wise as beautiful, but now thou art evidently joking about us or mocking us. These simple wares are altogether too plain for thine own use. Accept them for thy nurses and maidens for their everyday attire, and these stones send away to the kitchen boys to play with. But if thou wilt listen to me, let me say that on our ship we have very different velvets and brocades. We have also precious stones, far more precious than anyone has ever seen, yet we dared not bring them at once lest we might not suit thy temper and thy hearty wish. If thou shouldst decide to come in person and choose anything from among our possessions, they all are thine, and we bow to thee gratefully for the bright glance of thy beautiful eyes." The royal maid liked well enough these polite words of the handsome Simeon, and to her father she went. "Father and king, there have come to visit us some foreign merchants, and they have brought some goods never before seen in Busan. Give me thy permission to go on board their wonderful ship to choose what things I like. They also have rich gifts for thee." The king hesitated before answering her, frowning and scratching behind his ear. "Well," he said at last, "be it according to thy wish, my daughter, my beautiful Korolevna. And you, my counselors, order my royal vessel to be ready, the cannons loaded, and 100 of my bravest warriors detailed to escort the vessel. Send besides 1,000 heavy armed warriors to guard the Korolevna on her way to the merchant's vessel." Then the king's vessel started from the island of Busan. Numbers of cannon and warriors protected the princess, and the royal father remained quiet at home. When they reached the merchant's ship, the Korolevna Helena came down, and at once the crystal bridge was placed, and the Korolevna with all her nurses and maidens went on board the foreign ship, such a ship as they had never seen before, never even dreamed of. Meanwhile, the guards kept watch. The seventh Simeon showed the lovely guests everywhere. He was talking smoothly while leisurely unfolding his precious goods. The Korolevna listened attentively, looked around curiously, and seemed well pleased. At the same moment, the fourth Simeon, watching the proper moment, snapped the prow, and down to mysterious depths went the ship where no one could see her. The people on the king's vessel screamed in terror, the warriors looked like drunken fools, and the guards only opened their eyes wider than before. What should they do? They directed the vessel back to the island and appeared before the king with their terrible tale. "Oh, my daughter, my darling Princess Helena. It is God who punishes me for my pride. I never wanted thee to marry. No king, no prince would I consider worthy of thee, and now, now I know that thou art wedded to the deep sea. As for me, I am left alone for the rest of my sorrowful days." Then all at once he looked around and shouted to his men, "You fools! What were you thinking about? You shall all lose your heads. Guards, throw them into dungeons. The most cruel death shall be theirs, such a death that the children of their great-grandchildren shall shiver to hear the tale." Now, while the king of Busan raved and grieved, the ship of the brothers Simeon, like a golden fish, swam under the blue waters, and when the island was lost from sight, the fourth Simeon brought her to the surface, and she rose upon the waters like a white-winged gull. By this time, the princess was becoming anxious about the long time they were away from home, and she exclaimed, "Nurses and maidens, we are leisurely looking around, but I fancy my father the king finds the time sadly long." She hastily walked to the deck of the ship, and behold, only the wide sea was around her like a mirror. Where was her native island, where the royal vessel? There was nothing visible but the blue sea. The princess screamed, struck her white bosom with both hands, transformed herself into a white swan, and flew high into the sky. But the fifth Simeon, watching closely, lost no time, snapped his lucky gun, and the white swan was shot. His brother, the sixth Simeon, caught the white swan, but lo! Instead of the white swan, there was a silvery fish, which slipped away from him. Simeon caught the fish, but the pretty, silvery fish turned into a small mouse running around the ship. Simeon did not let it reach a hole, but swifter than a cat caught the mouse, and the Princess Helena, as beautiful and natural as before, appeared before them, fair-faced, bright-eyed. On a lovely morning a week later, the Tsar Arkady was sitting by the window of his palace, lost in thought. His eyes were turned toward the sea, the wide, blue sea. He was sad at heart and could not eat. Feasts had no interest for him. The costly dishes had no taste. The honey drink seemed weak. All his thoughts and longings were for the Princess Helena, the beautiful one, the only one. What is that far away upon the waters? Is it a white gull? Or are those white wings not wings, but sails? No, it is not a gull, but the ship of the brothers Simeon, and she approaches as rapidly as the wind which blows her sails. The cannon boom, native melodies are played on the chords of the masts. Soon the ship is anchored, the crystal bridge prepared, and the Korolevna Helena, the beautiful princess, appears like a never-setting sun, her eyes like bright stars, and oh, how happy is the Tsar Arkady! Run quick, my faithful servants, you brave officers of state, and you, too, my bodyguard, and all you useful and ornamental fellows of my palace, run and prepare, shoot off rockets, and ring the bells in order to give a joyful welcome to Korolevna Helena, the beautiful. All hasten to their tasks, to shoot, to ring the bells, to open the gates, to honorably receive the Korolevna. The Tsar himself came out to meet the beautiful princess, took her white hands, and helped her into the palace. "Welcome, welcome," said the Tsar Arkady. "Thy fame, Korolevna Helena, reached me, but never could I imagine such beauty as is thine. Yet, though I admire thee, I do not want to separate thee from thy father. Say the word, and my faithful servants will take thee back to him. If thou choosest, however, to remain in my tsarstvo, be the tsaritsa over my country and rule over me, the Tsar Arkady, also." At these words of the Tsar, the Korolevna Helena threw such a glance at the Tsar that it seemed to him the sun was laughing, the moon singing, and the stars dancing all around. Well, what more is there to be said? You certainly can imagine the rest. The courtship was not long, and the wedding feast was soon ready, for you know kings always have everything at their command. The brothers Simeon were at once dispatched to the king of Busan with a message from the Korolevna, his daughter, and this is what she wrote. "Dear father, mighty king and sovereign, I have found a husband according to my heart's wish, and I am asking thy fatherly blessing. My bridegroom, the Tsar Arkady Agivich, sends his counselors to thee, begging thee to come to our wedding." At the very moment when the merchant ship was to land at the island of Busan, crowds of people had gathered to witness the execution of the unfortunate guards and brave warriors whose ill luck it was to have allowed the princess to disappear. "Stop!" Simeon the seventh shouted aloud from the deck. "We bring a missive from the Korolevna Helena." Hala! Very glad indeed was the king of the island of Busan, and glad were all his subjects. The missive was read, and the condemned were pardoned. Evidently, the king said, "It is fated that the handsome and witty Tsar Arkadai and my beautiful daughter are to become husband and wife." Then the king treated the envoys and the brothers Simeon very well and sent his blessings with them, as he himself did not wish to go, being very old. The ship soon returned, and the Tsar Arkadai rejoiced over it with his beautiful bride, and at once summoned the 7 Simeons, the 7 brave peasants. He said to them, "Thanks. Thanks, my peasants, my brave tillers of the soil. Take as much gold as you wish. Take silver also, and ask for whatever is your heart's desire. Everything shall be given you with my mighty hand. Would you like to become boyars? You shall be the greatest among the very great. Do you choose to become governors? Each one shall have a town." The first Simeon bowed to the Tsar and cheerfully answered, "Thanks also to thee, Tsar Arkadayevich. We are but simple people, and simple are our ways. It would not do for us to become boyars or governors. We do not care for thy treasures either. We have our own father's field, which shall always give us bread for hunger and money for need. Let us go home, taking with us thy gracious word as our reward. If thou choosest to be so kind, give us thine order which shall save us from the judges and tax gatherers, and if we should be guilty of some offense, let thyself alone be our judge. And do, we pray thee, pardon the 7th Simeon, our youngest brother. His trade is surely bad, but he is not the first and not the last one to have such a gift. Let it be as you wish," said the Tsar, and every desire was granted to the 7 Simeons, and each one of them received a big tumbler of strong green wine out of the hands of the Tsar himself. Soon after this, the wedding was celebrated. Now, honorable dames and gentlemen, do not judge this story of mine too severely. If you like it, praise it. If not, let it be forgotten. The story is told, and a word is like a sparrow. Once out, it is out for good. Baba Yaga. Somewhere, I cannot tell you exactly where, but certainly in vast Russia, there lived a peasant with his wife, and they had twins, son and daughter. One day the wife died, and the husband mourned over her very sincerely for a long time. 1 year passed, and 2 years, and even longer. But there is no order in a house without a woman, and a day came when the man thought, if I marry again, possibly it would turn out all right. And so he did, and had children by his second wife. The stepmother was envious of the stepson and daughter and began to use them hardly. She scolded them without any reason, sent them away from home as often as she wished, and gave them scarcely enough to eat. Finally, she wanted to get rid of them altogether. Do you know what it means to allow a wicked thought to enter one's heart? The wicked thought grows all the time like a poisonous plant and slowly kills the good thoughts. A wicked feeling was growing in the stepmother's heart, and she determined to send the children to the witch, thinking sure enough that they would never return. "Dear children," she said to the orphans, "go to my grandmother, who lives in the forest in a hut on hen's feet. You will do everything she wants you to, and she will give you sweet things to eat, and you will be happy." The orphans started out. But instead of going to the witch, the sister, a bright little girl, took her brother by the hand and ran to their own old grandmother and told her all about their going to the forest. "Oh, my poor darlings," said the good old grandmother, pitying the children, "my heart aches for you, but it is not in my power to help you. You have to go not to a loving grandmother, but to a wicked witch. Now listen to me, my darlings," she continued. "I will give you a hint. Be kind and good to everyone. Do not speak ill words to anyone. Do not despise helping the weakest, and always hope that for you, too, there will be the needed help." The good old grandmother gave the children some delicious fresh milk to drink and to each a big slice of ham. She also gave them some cookies. There are cookies everywhere, and when the children departed, she stood looking after them a long, long time. The obedient children arrived at the forest and, oh, wonder, there stood a hut, and what a curious one. It stood on tiny hen's feet, and at the top was a rooster's head. With their shrill, childish voices they called out loud, Izbushka, Izbushka. Turn thy back to the forest and thy front to us. The hut did as they commanded. The two orphans looked inside and saw the witch resting there, her head near the threshold, one foot in one corner, the other foot in another corner, and her knees quite close to the ridge pole. Foe, 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 exclaimed the witch. I feel the Russian spirit. The children were afraid and stood close, very close together, but in spite of their fear, they said very politely, Ho, grandmother, our stepmother sent us to thee to serve thee. All right, I am not opposed to keeping you, children. If you satisfy all my wishes, I shall reward you. If not, I shall eat you up. Without any delay, the witch ordered the girl to spin the thread, and the boy, her brother, to carry water in a sieve to fill a big tub. The poor orphan girl wept at her spinning wheel and wiped away her bitter tears. At once all around her appeared small mice squeaking and saying, Sweet girl, do not cry. Give us cookies and we will help thee. The little girl willingly did so. Now, gratefully squeaked the mice, go and find the black cat. He is very hungry. Give him a slice of ham and he will help thee. The girl speedily went in search of the cat and saw her brother in great distress about the tub. So many times he had filled the sieve, yet the tub was still dry. The little birds passed, flying nearby, and chirped to the children. Kind-hearted little children, give us some crumbs and we will advise you. The orphans gave the birds some crumbs and the grateful birds chirped again. Some clay and water, children dear. Then away they flew through the air. The children understood the hint, spat in the sieve, plastered it up with clay, and filled the tub in a very short time. Then they both returned to the hut and on the threshold met the black cat. They generously gave him some of the good ham which their good grandmother had given them, petted him and asked, Dear kitty cat, black and pretty, tell us what to do in order to get away from thy mistress, the witch. Well, very seriously answered the cat, I will give you a towel and a comb and then you must run away. When you hear the witch running after you, drop the towel behind your back and a large river will appear in place of the towel. If you hear her once more, throw down the comb and in place of the comb there will appear a dark wood. This wood will protect you from the wicked witch, my mistress. Baba Yaga came home just then. Is it not wonderful? She thought, everything is exactly right. Well, she said to the children, today you were brave and smart. Let us see tomorrow. Your work will be more difficult, and I hope I shall eat you up. The poor orphans went to bed, not to a warm bed prepared by loving hands, but on the straw in a cold corner. Nearly scared to death from fear, they lay there, afraid to talk, afraid even to breathe. The next morning, the witch ordered all the linen to be woven and a large supply of firewood to be brought from the forest. The children took the towel and comb and ran away as fast as their feet could possibly carry them. The dogs were after them, but they threw them the cookies that were left. The gates did not open themselves, but the children smoothed them with oil. The birch tree near the path almost scratched their eyes out, but the gentle girl fastened a pretty ribbon to it. So they went farther and farther and ran out of the dark forest into the wide, sunny fields. The cat sat down by the loom and tore the thread to pieces, doing it with delight. Baba Yaga returned. Where are the children? She shouted, and began to beat the cat. Why hast thou let them go, thou treacherous cat? Why hast thou not scratched their faces? The cat answered, Well, it was because I have served thee so many years, and thou hast never given me a bite, while the dear children gave me some good ham. The witch scolded the dogs, the gates, and the birch tree near the path. Well, barked the dogs, thou certainly art our mistress, but thou hast never done us a favor, and the orphans were kind to us. The gates replied, We were always ready to obey thee, but thou didst neglect us, and the dear children smoothed us with oil. The birch tree lisped with its leaves, "Thou hast never put a simple thread over my branches," and the little darlings adorned them with a pretty ribbon. Baba Yaga understood that there was no help and started to follow the children herself. In her great hurry, she forgot to look for the towel and the comb, but jumped astride a broom and was off. The children heard her coming and threw the towel behind them. At once a river, wide and blue, appeared and watered the field. Baba Yaga hopped along the shore until she finally found a shallow place and crossed it. The children ran away as fast as their feet could possibly carry them. Illustrator unknown. Published in Folk Tales from the Russian, 1903, Core Collection Books. The children ran away as fast as their feet could possibly carry them. Illustrator unknown. Published in Folk Tales from the Russian, 1903, Core Collection Books. Again, the children heard her hurry after them, and so they threw down the comb. This time a forest appeared, a dark and dusky forest in which the roots were interwoven, the branches matted together, and the treetops touching each other. The witch tried very hard to pass through, but in vain, and so, very, very angry, she returned home. The orphans rushed to their father, told him all about their great distress, and thus concluded their pitiful story. "Ah, Father dear, why dost thou love us less than our brothers and sisters?" The father was touched and became angry. He sent the wicked stepmother away and lived a new life with his good children. From that time he watched over their happiness and never neglected them anymore. How do I know this story is true? Why, one was there who told me about it. The Flying Ship, the Snow Child. In a certain village lived a peasant named Ivan and his wife Mary. They were very fond of each other and had lived happily together for many years, but unfortunately they had no children. The poor people were sad on that account. Their hearts, however, were gladdened at the sight of their neighbors' children. What could be done? It was evidently the will of heaven, and in this world, heaven's will be done. One day, in winter, after a great quantity of snow had fallen on the ground, the children of the village where Ivan and Mary lived ran into the fields to play. The old couple looked at them from the window. The children ran about, played all sorts of frolics together, and at last began to make a snowman. Ivan and Mary sat down quietly watching them. Suddenly, Ivan smiled and said, "I say, wife, let us go out and make a snowman too." Mary was also in a merry mood. "Yes," she answered, "let us go out and play, though we are old." "But why should we make a snowman?" "Better to make a snow child, since heaven will not grant us a live one." "Very good," said Ivan. He put on his cap and went with his wife into the garden. They really set about making a baby of snow. They made the body, then arms and legs, then put on the top a ball of snow for a head. "Heaven help you," cried one who passed by. "Many thanks," replied Ivan. "Heaven's help is always acceptable," added Mary. "What are you doing?" continued the stranger. "What you yourself see," answered Ivan. "We are making a snigurka," cried Mary, laughing. Then they made a little nose and a chin, 2 little holes for eyes, and as soon as Ivan had finished, oh, wonderful, a sweet breath came out of its mouth. Ivan lifted up his arms and stared. The little holes were no longer holes. In their place were 2 bright blue eyes, and the tiny lips smiled lovingly upon him. "Mercy on us." "What is this?" cried Ivan, devoutly crossing himself. The snow child turned its head towards him. It was really alive. It moved its arms and legs inside the snow, like an infant in swaddling clothes. "Oh, Ivan," cried Mary, trembling with joy, "heaven has at last given us a baby," and she seized the child in her arms. The snow fell off Snigurka, as Mary called her, like the shell from a chicken. Mary, delighted beyond measure, held in her arms a beautiful, living girl. "Oh, my love." My love, my darling Snikerka, cried the kind-hearted woman, tenderly embracing her long-wished-for and now unexpectedly granted child. Then she rushed into the hut with the infant in her arms. Ivan was astounded at this wonderful event. As to Mary, she was beside herself with joy. Snikerka grew every hour. Each day she looked more beautiful than before. Ivan and Mary were delighted with her, and their hut, once so quiet and lonely, was now full of life and merriment. The girls of the village visited them constantly, dressed and played with Snikerka as if she were a doll, talked to her, sang songs to her, joined her with them in all their games, and taught her all they knew themselves. Snikerka was very clever and quickly learned everything she was told. During the winter she grew up as tall as a girl of 13 years old. She understood and could talk about most things around her, and had such a sweet voice that one would never tire of listening to it. Besides this, she was kind, obedient, and affectionate. Her flesh was as white as snow, her eyes looked like two forget-me-nots, and her hair was of a light flaxen color. Her cheeks only had no rosy hue in them, because there was no blood in her veins. In spite of this, she was so beautiful that, having once seen her, you would wish to see her again and again. It would have done your heart good to see how she enjoyed herself and how happy she was when at play. Everybody loved her. She was idolized by Mary, who would often say to her husband, "Heaven has granted us joy in our old age. Sorrow has left my heart." Ivan would answer, "Heaven be praised." But in this world happiness is seldom lasting, and sorrow is good for us all. The long winter had gradually glided away. The glorious sun again shone in the sky and warmed the cold earth. Where the snow melted, green grass appeared, and the skylark poured forth its sweet notes. The girls of the village collected together and welcomed the spring with a song. "Beautiful spring, how did you come to us? How did you make your journey? On a plow or on a harrow?" From a gay, sprightly girl, Snikerka suddenly became sad. "What is the matter with you, my dearest child?" Mary would often ask, drawing Snikerka nearer to her heart. "Are you ill? You are not so happy as you used to be. Perhaps an evil eye has glanced at you?" Snikerka would simply answer, "I am well, mother." The snow had now completely melted away, and the genial spring appeared with its warm and sunny days. The meadows and gardens began to be covered with radiant and sweet-scented flowers. The nightingale and other songsters of the woods and fields resumed their beautiful melodies. In a word, all nature became brighter and more charming. Snikerka alone grew sadder and sadder. She began to shun her playfellows and to hide herself from the rays of the sun like the mayflower under the tree. She would only play near a well of spring water, splashing and dabbling in it with her hand beneath the shade of a green willow. She grew daily fonder of the shade, the cool air, and the rain shower. During rain and in the evening, she would become more gay. When the sky became overcast with dark clouds and a thick shower of hail came pouring down, Snikerka was as pleased as any other girl would have been at the sight of a pearl necklace. When the hail melted and disappeared beneath the warm rays of the sun, Snikerka cried bitterly, as if she herself would melt into tears, as an affectionate sister might weep over a lost brother. The spring now ended, the summer came, and the feast of St. John was close at hand. All the girls from the village went into the wood to play. Several of them came to the hut and asked Mistress Mary to allow Snikerka to go with them. Mary was at first afraid to let Snikerka go, and the girl herself did not care about it, but they could not very well refuse the invitation. Then Mary thought it would perhaps amuse Snikerka. She therefore kissed her tenderly, saying, "Go, my dear child, go and enjoy yourself. And you, my good girls, take care of my Snikerka. You know she is as dear to me as my very sight." "All right. We'll take care," cried the girls, and they caught hold of Snegurka by the arms and ran away together to the forest. There they made garlands and bouquets of flowers and sang songs while Snegurka took part in their play. After sunset, the girls piled up a small heap of dry grass and brushwood, lighted it, and, with garlands on their heads, stood in a line, one close upon the other. They put Snegurka at the end and said, "When you see us running, you run after us." Then they began to sing and to jump over the fire. Suddenly they heard a painful cry. They turned round quickly, but could see nothing. Greatly surprised, they looked at each other and then noticed that Snegurka was missing. "Oh, the mischievous puss," cried the girls. "She has hidden herself." They ran in every direction in search of her, but all in vain. They called her by her name, Snegurka, but there was no answer. "Perhaps she has gone home," cried some of the girls. They all ran back to the village. Snegurka was not there. They searched for her the whole night, the following, and the third day. They examined the forest, every tree, every bush, but all to no purpose. Snegurka was gone. Old Ivan and Mary were almost broken-hearted at the loss of their beloved Snegurka. Every day Mary went to the forest to look for her lost child. Poor woman! Like a tender mother full of grief and yearning for her young one, she cried aloud, "Ah, me, my Snegurka! Ah, me, my darling dove! Where art thou?" She often fancied she could hear her dear Snegurka's painful cry when she disappeared. Alas! Alas! Snegurka was nowhere to be found. Where had Snegurka gone? Had some wild beast seized and dragged her into his lair? Or a bird of prey carried her across the dark blue sea to its nest? No, neither bird nor beast had carried the girl away. When Snegurka, following her companions, sprang over the fire, she melted away and changed in an instant into a beautiful white cloud, rose up, and disappeared in the sky forever.